What is the king asleep in the mountain motif? And why has this reoccurring theme manifested itself in the myths and folklore of numerous cultures worldwide from the ancient past right through to the present day, with examples of this motif found in the works of JRR Tolkien and, as we're about to discuss, George R.R. Martin as well. Hi, I'm Eldrick Stoneskin, and if you enjoy theories and analysis of A Song of Ice and Fire, make sure you hit the subscribe button below. The motif known as the king asleep in the mountain, also recognised as the sleeping hero motif, is a prevalent and reoccurring theme present in mythology, folklore and literature, which can be found across many different cultures throughout history. So much so that it appears as a listed motif in a catalogue of repeating folklore elements compiled by American folklorist Stith Thompson, known as the Thompson Motif Index, being specifically catalogued as entry D1960.2. This motif is often denoted as the Kyffhauser or king asleep in the mountain motif. And these types of stories can be identified by the following elements. King asleep in the mountain stories or sleeping hero stories involve legendary hero kings. These hero kings are thought to be dead, but are in fact sleeping in an inaccessible place, normally beneath the earth, under a mountain, within a cave, or in some supernatural realm. This sleeping hero is almost always a historical figure of some military consequence in the history of the nation where his resting place is located. This dormant king beneath the earth is often accompanied by an army or small retinue of soldiers that sleep alongside this historical ruler. This hero king remains in a state of undeath, waiting a summons to arise again with his knights and defend the nation in a time of deadly peril, and save their country and their people once more from beyond the grave. And the fact that this motif has been found repeated through countless stories across countless cultures speaks to the psychological underpinnings of its creation, with this trope often serving as a reminder of a nation's former glory and reflecting the desire for the return to this golden age within the culture's history, with many cultures having stories about a revered king who ruled justly and amassed great wealth and prosperity for his nation in the past before going to sleep beneath a mountain. And the idea that this sleeping king can never die and will return when needed the most gives the people of this culture hope that their protector is not gone but awaits to rise up as a hero from beyond the grave in a time of great hardship to defend his people once more from any neighbouring cultures that would have been seen as the other. Here are just some of the many examples of this motif playing out through myth and folklore throughout history. Our first example is probably our most famous one, being that of King Arthur, who, according to the legend, was taken away to Avalon to sleep until he was needed by the people of Britain. Several legends talk of a herdsman who stumbles across a cave on mainland Britain, wherein he finds Arthur sleeping, often with his knights, and his legendary sword Excalibur by his side. In the Czech Republic, we hear a tale of Saint Wenceslas of Bohemia, who is said to sleep in the Blanic mountain with a huge army of Czech knights and will emerge to protect his country at its worst time, riding on his white horse and wielding the legendary hero Brunvik's sword. In Danish legend, we have Ogier the Dane, who is said to reside in Kronborg Castle, where his beard has grown down to the floor, and it's said he sleeps here until some day when the country of Denmark is in its greatest peril, at which time he will awaken to save the nation once more. In Germany, we hear of Frederick Barbarossa, a Holy Roman Emperor who is the subject of many legends, including some that say he is not dead, but asleep with his knights in a cave in the Kyffhauser Mountains, and that when the ravens cease to fly around the mountain, he will awake to save the empire and restore Germany to its former greatness. Once again in Britain, there is also an enduring legend of a cavern full of knights in armour asleep at Alderley Edge, who in some versions reside with King Arthur, awaiting a call to decide the fate in a great battle for England. There is also a wizard involved in this story, who is referred to as Merlin in later versions of the legend. And speaking of Merlin, His story also follows the sleeping hero trope too, as in some tales he was imprisoned in an old oak tree by the Lady of the Lake. Other stories say that he was tricked into hiding in a cave near Cornwall, and it's said that he's still there to this day. We also have Thomas the Rhymer, who is said to be found under a hill with a retinue of knights in a tale from the Anglo-Scottish border. The story goes that Thomas fell under the Queen of Elfland's spell and followed her deep within the hollows of the Eidolon Hills to the fairy otherworld. Some say Thomas became immortal and still lives, gathering horses for the sleeping knights that rest deep within the hollow hills with him. And last but not least is Charlemagne, who is said to be living inside Mount Untersberg with his knights. And it's said that this emperor will eventually awaken, take on his armour and ride out with his knights and rescue Germany in a great battle. So as you can see, this idea of warrior kings sleeping in secluded locations, awaiting the call to return to life and defend the nation they ruled from an external threat of the other, is very prevalent through myth and folk tales throughout history. And the reason the King Under the Mountain motif has endured through time and across cultures and generations is because it taps into fundamental aspects of human psychology and ultimately speaks to a desire for protection and prosperity from a cultural hero of the past. And with these stories often containing elements of magic and resurrection, it also appears that the King Under the Mountain motif has left a clear and significant impact on fantasy literature as well, with many subsequent authors and creators having drawn inspiration from this reoccurring story element to craft their own stories of undead kings, sleeping warriors, and resurrected armies. With the most prominent example of an author adapting this motif for his own works being JRR Tolkien and his undead army beneath the mountains, known as the Dead Men of Dunharrow from The Lord of the Rings, who were a pre-Numenorian people who lived in the White Mountains and had worshipped Sauron before the foundation of Gondor. But after Gondor was founded, the leader of these mountain men, known as the King of the Mountains, swore allegiance to Isildur to fight by his side whenever Gondor called for aid. However, when Sauron rose again and Isildur summoned them, the men of the mountains were unwilling to turn against their former Dark Lord, who they had worshipped during the Dark Years. And in turn for refusing to fulfill their pledge, Isildur cursed these oathbreakers to remain as an army of warrior spirits residing in the mountains until they could fulfill their oath and answer the call of an heir of Isildur to fight the Dark Lord Sauron as originally promised. An oath we see fulfilled when Aragorn, a direct heir of Isildur's, calls them to his aid, literally summoning an undead king and his undead army to wake from beneath the mountains and fight Sauron, which in turn allows the curse to break. So as you can see, JRR Tolkien is clearly drawing on the historical motif of the king asleep in the mountain to inspire his version of this classic trope, with an undead king and an army of undead warriors from the mountains waiting to come forth and fight in defence of man. And I think George R.R. Martin might be doing just the same and drawing on this King Under the Mountain motif for influence in A Song of Ice and Fire as well. Because within the first few chapters of A Game of Thrones, and consistently throughout the series, we seem to be presented with a group of warrior kings hidden beneath the earth, who are heavily foreshadowed to wake from death and seem to be very concerned with the fact that winter is coming. He led the way between the pillars, and Robert followed wordlessly, shivering in the subterranean chill. It was always cold down here. Their footsteps rang off the stones and echoed in the vault overhead as they walked among the dead of House Stark. The Lords of Winterfell watched them pass. Their likenesses were carved in the stones that sealed the tombs. In long rows they sat, blind eyes staring out into eternal darkness, while great stone direwolves curled round their feet. The shifting shadows made the stone figures seem to stir as the living passed by. The crypts of Winterfell are a fascinating place, visited multiple times throughout A Song of Ice and Fire, and seemingly the main focus of each of these visits seems to be the stone kings we see seated on their thrones with their iron swords drawn across their laps. And amazingly, almost all the language surrounding these stone kings beneath the earth anthropomorphizes them, as if George is constantly describing them as though they are sat frozen in stone, alive but inanimate, awaiting resurrection, reminding us of all the other kings asleep beneath the earth that are said to wake and rise up in defence of their people that we've discussed while investigating the king asleep under the mountain motif. The first time we visit the crypts and see examples of this anthropomorphic language is with Robert and Ned in Ned's first chapter of A Game of Thrones, and upon entering, we heard that the dead sat on their stone thrones against the walls, implying that these ancient kings are still sitting here beneath the earth. This is furthered when we hear that the lords of Winterfell watched them pass, as if they are sat watching from their thrones as Robert and Ned walked through the crypts. It's then noted once again that these stone kings are seated in long rows with blind eyes staring out into eternal darkness, while great stone direwolves curled round their feet. And these stone kings are all but brought to life when we hear that the shifting shadows made the stone figures seem to stir as the living passed by. We then hear mention of Ned's father Rickard being sat with quiet dignity, stone fingers holding tight to the sword across his lap, once again anthropomorphizing these stone statues and presenting them as living people. Then, as Ned and Robert approach Lyanna's statue, we hear that Robert Baratheon's eyes lingered on Lyanna's face as if he could will her back to life. And we find this same language repeated a few moments later when we hear that Robert touched her cheek, his fingers brushing across the rough stone as gently as if it were living flesh. Then, as Robert and Ned prepare to leave, we hear once again that blind stone eyes seem to follow them as they passed, with Ned even thinking that all around them the dead of Winterfell seemed to watch with cold and disapproving eyes. And at the very end of the chapter, we hear that Ned could feel the eyes of the dead. They were all listening, he knew, and winter was coming. So as you can see, the foreshadowing for these kings presented as asleep under the earth awaiting resurrection during the first visit to the crypts is quite heavy and should imply its significance. And I think this is George's clever way of foreshadowing these stone kings as his version of the king asleep in the mountain motif. But the symbolic language suggesting these stone kings of winter coming to life only continues when Bran visits the crypts as well. This first example comes while Bran hides down in the crypts at the end of A Clash of Kings, when he thinks to himself that there are deeper levels where kings more ancient still sat their dark thrones, once again symbolically presenting the stone kings as if they are still sitting here beneath the earth after thousands of years. And in this same chapter, when Osha lights a torch around these stone kings, it seems to Bran that when the shadows moved, it looked for an instant as if the dead were rising as well. And we visit the crypts of Winterfell for the third time with Barbary Dustin and Theon Greyjoy in A Dance with Dragons, and by no coincidence, we only find more of the same foreshadowing. We first witness this when Lady Dustin initially asks Theon about the location of the crypts, when she says that somewhere beneath us are the crypts, where the old Stark kings sit in darkness, once again presenting the stone kings beneath the earth as still being sat here after all these years. And after Theon leads her to its location, immediately upon entering the crypts we find the stone kings anthropomorphized once again, when we hear that Theon could feel the stone kings staring down at him with their stone eyes, stone fingers curled around the hilts of rusted longswords. And after Barbary Dustin asks to see Ned's tomb and they begin to walk in its direction, we once again hear that the stone eyes of the dead men seem to follow them, and the eyes of their stone direwolves as well. But the foreshadowing for these kings beneath the earth possibly returning to life doesn't just happen during physical visits to the crypts. We also witness more of this same idea during dreams of the crypts as well. While Ned dreams of the crypts of Winterfell in King's Landing, he notes that the kings of winter watched him pass, and the direwolves at their feet turned their great stone heads and snarled. And as Ned progresses through this dream, when he gets to the tomb where his father slept, with Brandon and Lyanna beside him, he dreams that Lyanna's statue whispers to him. Jon's dreams of the crypts also give us this same foreshadowing, when he notes that their grey granite eyes turned to follow him as he passed, and their grey granite fingers tightened on the hilts of the rusted swords upon their laps. And later in this same dream, we hear that the Stone Kings were growling at him with granite tongues. In fact, we even see the kings rise from the grave in a further iteration of this dream when we hear that in the dark he'd heard the scrape of stone on stone. When he turned, he saw that the vaults were opening, one after the other, as the dead kings came stumbling from their cold black graves. So as you can see, it's actually quite hard to find a quote about these Stone Kings that doesn't symbolise them as living beings sitting sentinel, frozen in stone, awaiting resurrection. And in addition to hints at Stone Kings waking from beneath the earth like the king asleep under the mountain motif, we also find symbolic hints at the idea of a stone army residing down here beneath the earth as well. And interestingly, this happens with every group we see enter the Winterfell crypts. When we enter with Robert and Ned in a Game of Thrones, we hear that the flickering light touched the stones underfoot and brushed against a long procession of granite pillars that marched ahead, 2 by 2, into the dark, turning the stone pillars of the crypt into an animated stone army marching towards the darkness, symbolically representative of the long night. Then, while Bran is in the crypts in a Game of Thrones, we hear him describe that Maester Luwin was striding briskly down the vault, past a procession of stone pillars, symbolically giving us yet another symbolic stone army down here beneath the earth. And finally, with Theon and Barbary Dustin, we hear that Theon pushed the door open and led them out into a long vaulted tunnel, where mighty granite pillars marched 2 by 2 into blackness, once again giving us a symbolic stone army marching into the dark. And in my opinion, this repetitive militaristic symbolism we see on 3 separate occasions is George's clever way of foreshadowing a stone army rising from the crypts, ready to march into the darkness of the long night. Just like we see in the king asleep in the mountain motif, with kings beneath the earth foreshadowed to reanimate and the suggestion of an army beneath the earth as well. But what really furthers this connection between the heavily foreshadowed stone kings of the crypts waking to the motif of kings asleep under the mountain is the location of the very first Kings of Winter. Because if we recall what Bran said in regards to the burial order of the crypts, we hear that there are deeper levels where kings more ancient still sat their dark thrones, suggesting that the deeper the level within the crypts, the more ancient the king, meaning the lowest level must have the oldest and first Kings of Winter. And by no coincidence, it turns out that the lowest level is partly collapsed, making this section and the first Kings of Winter behind it hidden from sight and ultimately inaccessible, essentially giving us kings seated beneath the earth in a secluded and inaccessible area foreshadowed to rise again from death, just like the kings asleep under the mountain who await in a secluded area for resurrection that we've seen play out across countless stories throughout history in our sleeping hero motif, who are said to rise up at a time of great peril. Leading me to believe that the first stone kings behind the wall may have been influenced by this very motif and may rise again to defend their nation at a time of great peril, the long night. Just as we've seen with King Arthur, Ogier the Dane, Frederick Barbarossa, and Charlemagne, just to name a few. However, the idea of statues returning to life seems too high fantasy and too unrealistic for George's universe. But one thing George does love to do is take a classic fantasy trope, like statues returning to life, and make it realistic within the laws of his universe. Which I think is why George has included a disease in this series that can turn people like our first Kings of Winter into statues, a disease called grayscale. If you'd like to know more about this theory, I'd recommend checking out my Grayscale Kings under Winterfell series with the link at the end of this video or in the description below. But in essence, what I'm suggesting is that the first Kings of Winter were in fact turned into statues using grayscale to preserve their bodies for thousands of years beneath the earth so they could become George's version of the king asleep under the mountain motif made real within the laws of George's universe, residing behind the collapsed wall at the bottom of the crypts as an army of stone warriors sleeping on their thrones beneath the earth, waiting for a time that their nation is in great peril so they can rise up again and defend the realms of men from the others. And I think this idea of a stone warrior rising up in a time of need to defend the realms of men is being further foreshadowed by another statue within A Song of Ice and Fire that is also said to come to life. That being the Titan of Braavos, who is a giant stone man presented as wielding a broken sword. And just like the King Asleep in the Mountain motif, we hear that whenever Braavos stood in danger, he would wake with fire in his eyes, his rocky limbs grinding and groaning as he waded out into the sea to smash the enemies. Giving us another King in the Mountain example within A Song of Ice and Fire, one that I think George is using to foreshadow the stone kings beneath Winterfell, whose ancestral sword Ice is also broken, and who I think will wake when Winterfell and the realms of men are under threat from the others. But before we go, there is one final real-world example of the King Asleep in the Mountain motif that further supports this theory. And that is the tale of the last emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, Constantine XI Palaeologos, who on the day of his downfall is said to have fought fiercely against the opposing Ottoman Turks with a broken sword, who before his death is said to have been turned into stone, specifically marble, and thus became known as the Marble King. And after having become a stone statue, he was then said to have been hidden underground, behind the walled-up Golden Gate of Constantinople, asleep until his glorious return as the immortal emperor, which is said to be signalled by the appearance of a bright star in the sky, giving us a hero king with a broken sword who was turned to stone and hidden behind a wall until he could return to life and defend his nation, which is interestingly said to be signalled by the appearance of a bright star in the sky, reminding us of the comet we see in A Song of Ice and Fire that is said to signal the rebirth of Azor Ahai, the hero of the Long Night, who is also associated with broken swords, and a person that I think may have been turned to stone and hidden in the Winterfell crypts behind the collapsed wall, awaiting his rebirth. In my next video, we're going to look at the idea of sounding a horn to wake these ancient hero kings, which also happens to be a common element within the King Asleep in the Mountain motif in the real world as well, when we discuss the Horn of Winter and the giants that are said to waken the earth upon its sounding. So make sure you hit the subscribe button below, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure you give it a like and leave a comment with any other examples of the King Asleep under the Mountain motif that you can think of as well. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.